Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of our Chapter 17 lecture video. We're going to be diving into Lesson 4 and Lesson 5 today, but mostly focusing on Lesson 5. So let's get ourselves started here. This is the first slide that I showed you in our last video, just to help us understand where we're going. We've already done Lesson 1, 2, and 3 and focused on the clash of cultures. Now we're moving into Lesson 4 and 5, and we're going to be focusing on African American culture and politics. So, Lesson 4 overview. We've got 2 slides on Lesson 4. We're not going to spend much time there. Lesson 4 overview, cultural innovations. We've got a lot of artists and musicians and writers in the 1920s doing some amazing things. Popular culture and entertainment changes significantly because remember, it used to be lots of writing and newspapers and plays and things like that. And now we've come to the point where we're starting to go on air. We're starting to do radio programs. While the films aren't being broadcast like on TV, they're still being distributed to all sorts of places all across the United States. Even small towns had like a little movie theater. So popular culture, when we say pop culture, it means that it's a culture that just kind of gets blown out there into all of society, and is very, very popular. We have movie stars and we have singers. We have other kinds of artists. We have big sports stars, and athletics becomes very important. You've also seen some of the other heroes, probably like Charles Lindbergh, those kind of characters. They come to the forefront. One of my favorites is Charlie Chaplin. He's the guy there in that picture. And I think I'm going to put in a little video, maybe of Charlie Chaplin, maybe of some other silent film star. That was a really, really popular medium of entertainment during this time period, is silent films. An age of heroes. So to talk about the same characters here, we've got Charlie Chaplin, we have Amelia Earhart, we have Charles Lindbergh, of course, the first guy to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, Babe Ruth. We've even got some bad guys. We've got John Dillinger down here. Some other characters that we've seen, like at the end of our last lecture, we talked about Al Capone. He was considered a hero in some respects. So hero doesn't really mean what we think it means here. When I think of a hero, I think of someone like really, really awesome, just a wonderful person who's done heroic things. In this context, we're talking about somebody that people looked up to, maybe not for the best reasons. All right. So we're going to glide into Lesson 5. This is where we want to spend most of our time today. We've just spent about 3 minutes doing Lesson 4. We're going to spend the rest of our time on Lesson 5. African American culture and politics. I'm going to give you a moment. I want you to pause, and I'd like for you to write all this material into your notes, please. Pause. And unpause. Moving past that, we've got something that's called the Great Migration, 1917 to 1930. The Great Migration had a lot to do with World War I. I want you to imagine that during World War I, they called up about 2 million soldiers to fight, which was a large percentage. Not everybody actually got off to fight in Europe. I think we had hundreds of thousands of people actually end up in Europe, but that was just a small fraction of the number of people who volunteered or who were drafted to fight in World War I. Because so many people chose to enter into this or were entered into this whole military structure, it meant that there were some factory jobs and some other kinds of jobs that went unfilled. And it served as a draw for a lot of African Americans in the South. You might remember in some previous lessons, we talked about how bad it was in the South. We mentioned things like sharecropping and the deplorable conditions that a lot of rural African Americans were under. When 1917, 1918 came around, um, there were lots of openings up in the north in factories, and many African Americans in the South saw this as a great opportunity to lift themselves up out of the dirt and do something else. And so when you look at your map there, you can see that we've got about, was it seven or eight places on that map where a lot of African Americans went. Um, and if you look at those cities there, we've got St. Louis, we've got Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, we've got New York and other places here, Washington, D.C., of course. If you think about those cities, they have a large African American population. And they have a large African American population because of the Great Migration from 1917 to 1930. Yeah, it wasn't the promised land that I guess they were hoping for, but it did offer lots of opportunities to live in groups, and in those groups they found a lot of support. We're going to keep on moving. Harlem. Harlem is one of those groups. Harlem is actually a neighborhood in New York, and this was a poem by Langston Hughes um, that kind of expresses, I think, some of the frustration that a lot of African Americans were feeling at this time. And I'll let you read it there. There's a lot of really interesting imagery there, isn't there? We're going to keep on moving. The Harlem Renaissance in general. The Harlem Renaissance was a period of African American racial pride and artistic development, and it took place in the Harlem neighborhood. You can say that there were parallel renaissances that were happening in other uh, uh, African neighborhoods in other cities, but the Harlem Renaissance was the famous one. And we want to talk about it a little bit because it's very pleasant, but also very sad. I want you to imagine you're an African American writer. If you're on your own in some little town down in the South, you could write books, but you probably didn't feel the support. You probably didn't feel the neighborhood value. You probably didn't feel the camaraderie, the support that people in a place like Harlem could. You have to imagine when you were living in Harlem, you were surrounded by other black people. When you left your door out of your apartment, there would be a black pharmacist nearby, a black um, uh, dry cleaner, a black banker, the guy picking up your garbage in the street, he was a black guy. The police officer might be a black guy. You were in you were in a little island of blackness in this city, and it was an escape. You could feel as if you belonged. And that's something that a lot of African Americans didn't get in so many other places, especially like in the South. So you can kind of understand why Harlem was a special place. All right, I'll let you read some more there about the writers and the musicians and the theater performers. A new black consciousness. African Americans fled to the North to escape discrimination and found that after the First World War, things could be just as bad in northern industrial cities. So you get this black culture that develops, and really you kind of have to hide in the African American neighborhood in order to feel as if you're really living a life. So it's like you're free as long as you don't go out. So notice the three women there. They are dressed like flappers, aren't they? They're African American flappers. And our last slide for the day, Marcus Garvey. This guy right here, he's actually not African American. He is Jamaican. And he came up from the island of Jamaica and entered into city life in New York City. And because he had not grown up with the racism that so many Southern Africans had experienced their entire lives, I think he had probably less patience with it. He was all about finding solutions to problems. I think some African Americans had kind of resigned themselves to the fact that this racism existed, and how do you cope with it? He wasn't about coping. He wanted to solve it, or at least find a way around it. So Marcus Garvey started setting up a business. He organized the Universal Negro Improvement Association, an organization, and that organization did things that were commercial and ethnic and all sorts of amazing things. There's a little country in Africa called Liberia, and I've marked it here on the map in red. And I want you to notice that it's just a tiny little country on this southern coast of the western part of Africa. Liberia was developed actually long before Marcus Garvey. It's called Liberia because it was a place where African Americans from North America could go to. You could go back to Africa. Most African Americans, when they thought of the idea of going back to Africa, were kind of disgruntled by it, because you have to imagine, if you're an African American person and you were born in Alabama, your grandma was born in Alabama, and you lived your entire life in Alabama, the idea of going back to Africa was just kind of funny, because you were an African in essence. But there is the possibility that if you wanted to, you could go back to Africa. So Marcus Garvey set up a steamer line, a ship line, and they started trading with Africa, and they actually did quite well. He opened up businesses that could support African Americans and Africans. He helped African Americans who wanted to go back to Africa, and he was a very vocal proponent of being African and being proud of it. So it's all the more sad that he was basically shut down. He had to go back to Jamaica. And let me tell you a little story about how that happened. He was advertising his Black Star line. I want you to imagine that there's like a little letter that goes out to a lot of people that were supporting him. He was looking for some money. He was trying to get some investment. So he sent out a letter, and in the letter there was a picture that showed 5 steamers in a row in the port. And each one of them had this large black star on it, and he was raising some money. Well, one white person who didn't like him got their hands on this letter, and figured out that Marcus Garvey actually didn't own 5 boats with the black star on them. That photo had been doctored just a little bit to make it look like there were more ships than he actually had. And so they charged him with mail fraud, and he had to leave the United States and go back to Jamaica. One little technicality. And it was because you had some white guy that was like, I don't know, just couldn't cope with it. Kind of sad. So I'm going to stop our video right there, our video lecture. We've gone through an entire chapter, 5 lessons in less than 30 minutes, which is incredible. Make sure that you take notes and everything. On Friday, there is going to be a quiz on this chapter. Do the work that comes along with these videos. If you need some help, I will always be on Google Hangouts during our regular class time. And I'll see you soon, okay? I'm looking at myself. It looks like I need a haircut. Problem is I can't leave and get a haircut. Maybe my neighbor can cut my hair. I'll look into it. She probably can't cut it legally though, right? Maybe in another 2 weeks or so. All right. I got problems, right? I need a haircut. See you later. Bye, everyone.